When anti-Americanism can't put food on the table, is Cuba ready to back down? This is Jersey's news commentary channel. In the past few days, 3 striking developments have suddenly emerged in Cuba. First, Miguel Díaz-Canel, first secretary of the Cuban Communist Party and president of Cuba, publicly acknowledged that Cuba has begun talks with the United States. He said these contacts aim to resolve differences through dialogue and hopefully move the two countries from long-term confrontation toward some form of easing. Second, rare protests have erupted across several Cuban cities. In some places, angry residents even stormed Communist Party offices, burned furniture, and threw objects, protesting prolonged blackouts and severe food shortages. Third, U.S. President Donald Trump openly declared that after dealing with Iran, the next one will be Cuba. He even suggested that the United States might take over Cuba. Put these 3 developments together and they point to one simple reality: Cuba's long-standing anti-American politics is running headfirst into the wall of reality. Why has Cuba suddenly moved toward negotiations? The answer is straightforward: the economy can no longer hold up. Over the past 2 years, Cuba has been experiencing the worst energy and economic crisis it has faced in decades. Nationwide blackouts have become frequent, with many areas losing electricity for more than 10 hours a day. Food shortages, fuel shortages, and medicine shortages have become routine. In 2026, the country even experienced a collapse of the power grid, plunging large parts of the nation into darkness. The underlying reasons are not complicated. Cuba has almost no domestic energy resources and relies heavily on imported oil, and that oil has primarily come from one country, Venezuela. But Venezuela's former president Nicolas Maduro has reportedly been detained and transferred to New York by U.S. authorities. Venezuela itself has undergone political change, and in any case its economy has already fallen into deep crisis. At the same time, the United States has increased pressure on Cuba's energy supply, further tightening the island's access to oil. The result is simple: the lights go out. The fuel runs dry. The economy stalls. When a country can no longer even generate electricity, anti-American slogans begin to lose their power. Many people wonder why Cuba has insisted on anti-Americanism for decades. The reason is simple: anti-Americanism used to be a profitable political business. During the Cold War, anti-Americanism brought Soviet aid. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, anti-Americanism brought Venezuelan oil. Cuba's survival model was actually very straightforward: anti-Americanism in exchange for resources. Anti-Americanism could literally put food on the table. As long as there was an anti-US geopolitical camp in the world, Cuba had room to survive. But today, that structure has collapsed. The Soviet Union is gone. Venezuela has fallen into crisis. No new patron has appeared. And so anti-Americanism can no longer provide the food. Once external aid disappears, the meaning of anti-American rhetoric changes. It is no longer primarily a diplomatic strategy. Instead, it becomes a domestic political tool. In one sentence: anti-Americanism for domestic stability, negotiations with Washington for national survival. Inside the country, the government continues to promote anti-American propaganda. In foreign policy, however, it quietly seeks dialogue with the United States. That is the real state of Cuban politics today. But the problem is that reality has now exceeded society's tolerance threshold. The streets of Cuba have begun to say no. In recent years, protests in Cuba have been increasing steadily. In 2025 alone, more than 11,000 incidents of social protest and public expressions of discontent were recorded. The most recent unrest has been even more direct and more intense. Residents have banged pots in protest, held nighttime demonstrations, and even stormed Communist Party offices. In Cuba, such scenes are extremely rare. And when street protests appear in a highly controlled society like Cuba, it usually signals one thing: livelihood pressures can no longer be suppressed. The United States is now applying what can be described as a dual pressure strategy toward Cuba. On the one hand, it continues to maintain and even strengthen economic pressure. On the other hand, it repeatedly signals that an agreement could be reached. Trump has even said that either a deal will be made, or the United States will do what it has to do. In essence, the strategy is simple: force Cuba to negotiate. And today, Cuba has indeed been pushed to the negotiating table by a deeply deteriorating reality. For decades, anti-Americanism stood at the center of Cuba's political narrative. But today, an increasingly obvious truth is emerging: anti-Americanism can explain poverty, but it cannot solve poverty. It can generate emotions, but it cannot generate electricity. It can shout slogans, but it cannot produce bread. When the lights stay off for long periods, when store shelves remain empty, when young people continue leaving the country, even the loudest slogans begin to sound hollow. Today, Cuba effectively faces three possible paths. First, continue the anti-American stance while the country becomes poorer and poorer. Second, fully open the economy risking a fundamental shakeup of the existing political structure. Third, pursue limited reforms seeking reconciliation with the United States to gain economic breathing space. Every path comes with a cost. But one thing is becoming increasingly clear: anti-Americanism can no longer put food on the table. If energy supplies continue to shrink, if the economy continues to deteriorate, if protests continue to spread, Cuba will ultimately have to answer a difficult question: how long can a country survive on anti-American slogans alone?